We are studying the life of Paul. We have just begun. Our first lesson in this is all we've ever done thus far, and so this is the second lesson. And one might ask the question, why study the life of Paul? And the fact is that Paul is a very significant person in the New Testament. Very significant. Nobody else writes as many books in the New Testament as he does. While there are those that write larger works, such as John, in writing the book of John, and also writing the book of Revelation, while there are other larger works that clearly are there, Luke and Acts, that's large sections. Paul writes more books than anyone else in the New Testament. And while we are introduced to Paul, Saul of Tarsus, in chapter 7, verse 58, I do believe, of Acts, that's the first place we see Paul. And unlike many others, he is not one who's seeking Christ. Unlike others, when we go back to places like John chapter 1, we see those who are readily looking for the Christ. And when they are told who it is, that it is Jesus of Nazareth, they latch on to him quick. Peter is one of those. Andrew before him, and also Nathanael. We see where they latch on very quickly in this, but Saul of Tarsus is not. Saul of Tarsus is completely against the church. He would side with the Sanhedrin court in the Sanhedrin court's decision to crucify Jesus of Nazareth. And also, he sides with those, clearly sympathetic with those who killed Stephen. Stephen absolutely guilty of nothing. And Christ as being innocent. But not only does he write most of the New Testament books, but the book of Acts really is divided between two major people in there. Now, others are mentioned, obviously, and others such as Philip being shown what he did in Acts chapter 8, significant things. But most of the book of Acts it covers two individuals. One is Peter and the other is Paul. And while we have already known Peter from the Gospels, we learn of Saul of Tarsus from the book of Acts. And we see in the book of Acts that full development that goes from him being a young man who is taking care of the garments of those who go to stone Stephen, to a man who is on his way. Actually, he arrives in Italy. He is a prisoner of the Roman Empire, and that's quite a journey. That's quite a journey of the Saul of Tarsus of Acts chapter 7:58, going to all the way to Paul the Apostle in chapter 28. All right, that's a long journey, and he spends a great deal of his adult life serving Christ, and he goes from one extreme to another. And why is that? One, he has zeal for God. Now, it's misplaced. To begin with, it's entirely misplaced, but it's still that zeal for God. Exactly as had been said, they have a zeal for God, but without knowledge. It's a zeal that has nothing backing it, a zeal of going full bore and having no idea what direction they're actually going. But the intent is there, the heart is there, but they're going full bore or full speed in the wrong direction because it's completely in ignorance. Now, last time we discussed, in our first lesson, we were giving really the early life of Paul and discussing that Paul was born in Tarsus of Cilicia. Acts 22 and verse 3. I am indeed a Jew born in Tarsus of Cilicia. So that's where he's born. He's born in Tarsus. Now, he is educated. His higher education would be in Jerusalem under one of the best teachers, if not the best teacher of the age, which was Gamaliel. Gamaliel was a Pharisee, and he would have been considered the absolute top, or one of the top 5 anyway, teachers of the day, if not the top. And he also states in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 22, concerning himself, are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they the seed of Abraham? So am I. He is a Jew, and he is also from the tribe of Benjamin. He knows someone of the day, that is, of the earlier half of the first century at least. Second half probably would be that many or all of them in the second half knew their tribe. They knew their tribe. They knew what tribe they belonged to, because that was all part of having the inheritance and knowing your part in Israel. Whether you can be a priest or not, well, you got to know if you're a Levite. If you're not a Levite, you can't be a priest. Every tribe had its own history, and he is of the tribe of Benjamin, which he carries that name of Saul. Saul was the first ruler, first king of Israel, and he's from Benjamin. Well, this is a different Saul of Benjamin. That was Saul, son of Kish. This is Saul who becomes Paul the Apostle. Philippians chapter 3, beginning in verse 4, though I also might have confidence in the flesh, if anyone else thinks he may have confidence in the flesh, I more so. Circumcised on the 8th day, of the stock of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of the Hebrews, concerning the law, a Pharisee, concerning zeal, persecuting the church, concerning the righteousness which is in the law, blameless. Here is Paul's resume, and it's stellar from the Jewish standpoint. It's stellar. You could not be more loyal than he had been. You could not be better educated than he had been. You can't be more deeply Jewish than he was. You couldn't be. But he was willing to push that all aside. That means nothing to him. The credentials meant nothing. The honors meant nothing. What that would have meant in Jewish society and what that would have carried along with it meant nothing. He's willing to push that aside because he's willing to consider that just rubbish. Absolute rubbish. It's meaningless. That doesn't get you in heaven. That does not make you pleasing to God. It doesn't. Because just like the rest of us, it's not because of Paul's righteousness that he's born a Jew. And it's not because of our unrighteousness that we're not born a Jew. All right? No one chose where they were going to be born, who were their parents, none of that, what time we were going to be born. None of us chose that whatsoever. And so it's meaningless. It's meaningless in the scheme of salvation. Circumcised on the 8th day? All right? That's meaningless now. Now, under the law of Moses, which under the law of Moses has been done away with at the cross, under the law of Moses that had meaning, okay, but no more. That of a tribe of Benjamin, that of a Hebrew of the Hebrews, that of a Pharisee, all that is meaningless to him. Now, with we talked about this briefly last time, in that his father was a Pharisee. In Acts chapter 23, and beginning, just in verse 6, But when Paul perceived that one part of the Sadducees and the other one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, "Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. Concerning the hope and resurrection of the dead, I am being judged." All right. His father was a Pharisee. He himself was a Pharisee as well. And that would explain why he had Gamaliel as a teacher, because Gamaliel was a Pharisee. If you didn't want your child to be a Pharisee, you would not have him being taught by Gamaliel or a Pharisee, a teacher. Understand what that means. All right. The Jews in the first century, and actually prior to the first century, had numerous sects. Matter of fact, these sects come about in the intertestamental period. And you have the Sadducees having a belief. They all had their creeds, just like denominations do. They all had their creeds. The Sadducees were more Hellenistic. What does that mean? They're more secular. They want to be more like the Greeks in Greek culture, and the Romans. Romans following Greek culture. They just inherited it and continued it on, really. But they're more Hellenist. They're more secular. And there are certain things that, they didn't believe in angels, they didn't believe in spirits, didn't believe in the resurrection. There's numerous things they just didn't believe. That is a sect of the Jew. Pharisees were very strict. They did believe in the resurrection. They did believe in angels. They believed in spirits. They believed in Moses, and Moses as being a prophet of God and his words being very literal. But that wasn't enough for them. All right, it's not enough to be a follower of the law of Moses. You've got to crank it down further. Or, another way of saying it, ratchet it up. All right? That if the law of Moses, let's just put this in an illustration of numbers. If the law of Moses says 5, and you are following the law at 5, Pharisees would say 8. All right. Did God demand 8? And now understand, this is just, I'm just using these as illustrations. Did God demand 8? No. But the Pharisees do. And they would demand that you do 8 as well. Now, put this into something that is actual example. That you have Christ and his disciples on the Sabbath day. They are in a field of grain. And the disciples are plucking the grain off of the stalk. Whether it is wheat or barley, I don't know what it is. But they're plucking it off, and they're rubbing it in their hands, the grains in their hands, to get the chaff off, and they're eating the grain. Was there anything under the law of Moses that said you could not do that on the Sabbath day? That would in fact be work? The answer is no. But the Pharisees go to Christ and they say, "Why are your disciples doing that? They're going against the laws concerning the Sabbath." No, they weren't. That's the Pharisaic idea. That's the traditional idea that just got handed down through the ages, through the past few centuries, is all that is. Something that's come up through the rabbis, and that was to be held. All right, that's who Paul was. Paul was among the Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees, let's just continue talking about the sects of the day, because there were others. There were others that were far more political, and really we wouldn't call them a religious sect, but they are a segment of Jewish society. That's the Herodians. Herodians were very secular, very much anti-Jewish, anti-Moses, anti anything remotely that would remind them of the law of Moses or of traditional Judaism. They were secularists. They sought political powers. They were like that. You also had the Zealots. The Zealots, also a political movement, not a religious movement, but they despised being under Roman authority and wanted to remove Israel out of the Roman Empire, or just chase the Romans out. All right. And there were extremes in them. It's not like the Zealots were a united movement. They weren't. There were competing groups in this. Some were far worse at what they were doing. Far worse, I mean, far more wicked and murderous than others. Then you also have others like the Essenes. The Essenes were an unusual group. There weren't very many of them. And of course, they're not even mentioned in the Bible, in the biblical text. But they were around in the first century. And the Essenes were almost like a monastic order. It's like the beginnings of monasticism in the West, though I don't know that that's the case. But for the Jews never had anything like that before. What's a monastic order? Monastic order is like monks and nuns, is what that is. And they were very strict, much more so than the Pharisees were. But they were a small group. It'd be very hard to make that popular. It'd be very hard to have many followers in that. But actually, they're the ones responsible for bringing us, saving for us the Dead Sea Scrolls, what we refer to as the Dead Sea Scrolls. That was their library that they tucked away to keep it safe from the Romans, because they knew that the Romans were going around destroying everything, burning everything. They wanted to preserve their library, so they took it from wherever they kept their books and their scrolls, and they hid them there in the caves around the Dead Sea, which remained untouched until 1947, 48, somewhere around in there. So did they ever preserve them? Okay, now, Paul is a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. We've already made mention he had a teacher, as Gamaliel was his teacher. Acts 22:3, I am indeed a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, taught according to the strictness of our father's law, and was zealous toward God as you are all today. Now, he is speaking to a mob. Matter of fact, he starts that speech by saying, brethren and fathers, hear my defense before you now. All right? And he speaks of his background, and the background of being taught by Gamaliel, being like they were, and he was precisely like they were. That's why they hated him, because he was one of them, and now he's the enemy. That's being a traitor. He was precisely one of them, and would have been one of the greats among them, but now has switched over to become a Christian. Now, in his early life, as was the tradition of the Jews, and it is a very good tradition. Other cultures had it. I don't know that all cultures of the day had it, but it's a very good thing. That is, when a boy is young, and I think it's around 12 years old, but I could be wrong about that. It may be a little bit young, earlier than that. But around 12 years old, a boy is to start learning a trade. Now, that doesn't mean that's what he's going to become, but it could be. It could be that that's what he becomes. And he is taught it by an older man. someone who has plenty of experience in it, and here this person, this young boy, becomes an apprentice, and he's learning from the ground up the skills involved in whatever it happens to be. Whether it's carpentry work, which is precisely what Jesus did, or whether it is tent making, which is what Paul did, which evidently was a lucrative trade, that of tent making. And let's just read this. Acts 18, beginning in verse 1. After these things, Paul departed from Athens and went to Corinth. And he found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome. And he came to them. Okay, so here we have Paul in Corinth. He finds this couple. This couple, they are Jewish. They have been cast out of Rome by Caesar, Claudius Caesar. Simply because Claudius got tired of the Jews for whatever reason and sent them packing. You got to leave. There's a long history of things like that going on. There's a long history of that. Actually, we can go all the way back to the book of Exodus, where they weren't asked to leave. They were made to stay. But it is Jews as being visitors inside a nation. Now, or living inside a nation. He commanded Priscilla and Aquila to leave. So, verse 3, so because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for by occupation they were tent makers, which he has the same trade as them. And here's just one of those little facts that comes up that we didn't really need until we get to chapter 18, because it doesn't make mention of him being a tent maker at all. But this would have been a lucrative thing to do. Why? Because typically when we think of tents, we think of someone going camping. But there's a lot more tents than just going camping. There would be pavilions needed for shops that are in the marketplace. There would be awnings needed. Awnings were not a foreign thing. There would be numerous things that can be used in numerous ways. And he would have been one that is able to put those together. What kind of tent do you want? Do you want it to shed water? Okay. Do you want it lightweight? Do you want it to take high winds? What is it that you want out of this? And what are you going to be using it for? And he would be skilled in doing this. And he had that skill. But we don't see where his career path had anything to do with tent making. I mean, when we first see him, it's not like he's the tent maker of Jerusalem, because he's not. And when we see him in Acts chapter 9, he's not known as Saul the tent maker. He's going out doing the business of the high priest in the Sanhedrin court. All right, that was a different career path for him. And all of this, just because he knew that, does not mean that is set in his life. That's what he is for the rest of his life. He's a tent maker. Nope. But being that he had these skills, it meant that he didn't always have to have support from congregations to help him along, which he did get support. But he didn't always have to have that. He could live wherever he went, as long as there was a city with a marketplace, which all cities have marketplaces. He can set up shop if he needs to. He can begin getting the materials he needs. He knows what he needs, and he can begin making things that could be purchased by people. And like I said, there's numerous reasons for armies need tents, and not just for men to sleep in. They need pavilions, and they need these things. So it could be a very lucrative trade. and that was enough for him to live on. And Priscilla and Aquila, evidently they were doing that in Rome, but they've been cast out. Now they're in Corinth, and this is how he meets them. They have a lot of things in common. They're Jewish, and they make tents. And so he joins with them, and Priscilla and Aquila become valuable in the church. They become very well known and very powerful in the Word, and are able to correct someone like Apollos when they discover Apollos doesn't know everything he needs to know. And Apollos isn't teaching everything he needs to teach. It was just a matter of ignorance on Apollos' part, but they were able to supply what he lacked. Now, we mentioned that Paul was a Roman citizen, and he is born a Roman citizen. In Acts 21, beginning in verse 39, but Paul said, I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city. Okay. And in chapter 16, beginning in verse 38, but Paul said to them, they have beaten us openly, uncondemned Romans, and have thrown us into prison. And now do they put us out secretly? No, indeed. Let them come out themselves and get us out. And the officers told these words to the magistrates, and they were afraid when they heard that they were Romans. All right, so chapter 16, that's Paul and Silas. They've been thrown into jail. And it's just assumed they're not citizens. They're not Roman citizens at all. Once it's discovered they are Roman citizens, okay, that changes everything. And the magistrates and everyone involved could have been punished severely for that to have happened because of what they did. They could have been punished severely. And that is why Paul says, let them come and get us out. They're not going to put us out secretly. Let them come and get us out. They're the ones that threw us in here. And here is one of those things that makes Paul unique from the other apostles. And he has several things that are unique. Obviously, they're his. Every apostle had something, everybody has something unique about them. But he's a Roman citizen. He can travel wherever he likes, and these things can't just happen to him. Now they do by people who just are making assumptions, like here in Philippi. They're just making assumptions. Here's just a couple of Jews, we're going to throw them in jail. All right, well, they happen to be Roman citizens too. That carries with it a weight that you cannot throw a Roman citizen in jail uncondemned. Others, obviously you could, but not Roman citizens. They had more rights than others inside the Roman Empire. They had more rights. And so he is able to do what others could not do so easily. And being a Roman citizen gave him certain privileges to where he could, and eventually he does, appeal to Caesar. Okay, Peter could never appeal to Caesar. And none of the rest of the apostles could appeal to Caesar. Anyone who is not a Roman citizen cannot do that. But a Roman citizen does have that right. And that is how Paul is going to be able to do precisely what Jesus has called him to do. And we'll get to that once we get to Acts chapter 9. What he's been called to do, and that is he is going to be sending the word not only to the Jews but also the Gentiles, and that there's going to be kings that are going to hear this message. And there will be. There will be kings. Caesar being one, and we find that those in Caesar's household do become Christians. Caesar himself does not, but there are those of, we don't know who they were precisely, but those of his household, they did become Christians. And it's all because of the work of Paul. There's no other explanation for it. But in Acts chapter 22, beginning in verse 25, And as they bound him with thongs, Paul said to the centurion who stood by, "Is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman and uncondemned?" When the centurion heard that, he went and told the commander, saying, "Take care what you do, for this man is a Roman." Then the commander came and said to him, "Tell me, are you a Roman?" He said, "Yes." The commander answered, "With a large sum I obtained this citizenship." And Paul said, "But I was born a citizen." Okay? The commander was not born a citizen. He had to pay a large sum to be a citizen. Paul didn't have to be. Someone earlier, whether it was his father or grandfather or whomever it was, someone earlier had to have done something to have become a citizen. To where Paul, he's one man up over this commander. I was born a citizen. I've been a citizen all my life. Whereas the commander could not say that at all. And commanders over a Roman military. I was born a citizen. Then immediately those who were about to examine him withdrew from him, and the commander was also afraid after he found out that he was Roman and because he had bound him. He knew he was in trouble. And if Paul wanted to do something about it, he could have done something about it if he wanted to. Just like in Philippi. Philippi, he doesn't. He just lets it go. He doesn't make a big to-do about it, though he could have. But Paul doesn't do that. Now,
How could he have been born a citizen? His parents were citizens?
they had to be citizens. Yeah, his father and his mother must have been citizens of Rome. And how they were they born citizens of Rome? We don't know. They could have. Or they could have paid that sum and become citizens before Paul is born. But yeah, his parents had to have been citizens. And you know, it is possible for someone to be Jewish and a Roman citizen at the same time. Just like it was possible that someone could be from Gaul or from a Celt from Britain or someone in a Germanic tribe or a Frank or a Spaniard to have paid the price and become a citizen. Or if their parents had done it, they would be Roman citizens, though they're not Italian and weren't born anywhere close to Rome. They could be Roman citizens. And in Rome, you had quite a dividing line of citizen and non-citizen. There's a lot of non-citizens. And as a non-citizen, it just meant you didn't have the same rights that citizens had. You had the right to exist, and yeah, there would be, people couldn't steal from you or do things like that from you. You still had certain rights, and justice would be up to a certain level. But Roman citizens had the greatest rights of them all. And of course, there were those in the Roman Empire, and evidently was a great amount, that were in fact slaves. And slaves came from all over. They would have been, of course, the word slave comes from the word Slavic. There's a lot of Slavics that were made slaves. And of course, you had those from Germania or from North Africa. They would have just been from all over that would have been slaves. But slaves in those days could have had all kinds of occupations and being used in numerous ways. But Paul is a citizen. He is above all of that. Now, let's go to Acts chapter 7. Acts chapter 7. And here Paul is first introduced And in the way this is written, it's typical in the way the Bible does things. It's very, very typical of where we have something major that happens, and then someone is being introduced to us with a little fact, and as we're reading it, and I do mean reading it for the first time, you'd wonder, okay, this is someone obviously who's going to be significant later. Don't know who it is. But we have the stoning of Stephen, and we have this little fact about, well, as a matter of fact, let's just go to verse 54. So we're in Acts chapter 7, verse 54. When they heard these things, they were cut to the heart, and they gnashed at him with their teeth. That is, gnashing at Stephen with their teeth. All right? They are enraged. This is a mad mob. But he, that's Stephen, being full of the Holy Spirit, gazed into heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. Now, as Bob pointed out a number of weeks ago, he's doing the book of Acts. He noted of Jesus standing. And that does have a meaning. That Jesus, not only is he at the right hand of God, but he's standing. And he wondered what that would mean. And in my mind, we didn't really discuss it, but in my mind, it is Jesus is standing for a martyr. That's what he's doing. And this is a first one. Jesus, but I don't think is just standing for the first one. Jesus is standing for a martyr. Someone who is putting down their life for him. And he's honoring that. And again, it's going to be much greater honor than that still. And said, look, I see the heavens opened. This is Stephen saying this. I see the heavens opened and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. Then they cried out with a loud voice, stopped their ears, and ran at him with one accord. They stopped their ears. They don't want to hear him saying this. They don't want this to be even remotely true, that he is seeing these things. I see heavens open and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. No. They are just so enraged, they don't want the words. They don't want the words entering into their minds. And so they ran at him with one accord, verse 58, and this seems to be like a minor detail. And they cast him out of the city and stoned him. Now that's not a minor detail, but the next one is, and the witnesses laid down their clothes at the feet of a young man named Saul. Okay, we don't get any of the names of those that did the act of murder. We don't get any of the names of those who are the witnesses. We know Stephen. We know that the ones who stoned him were Greek-speaking Jews. We know that. It's the group of Greek-speaking Jews. And just so happens, Saul is one of them. And of course he would be, because he was born in Cilicia. He knows Hebrew, but he also knows Greek. And he would be among those. He would, I don't know about identifying with, but he would be among those of the Greek-speaking Jews, while others would not be. But he is. And here we have him being this young man named Saul. And we have to ask the question, and just in reading this for the first time, ask the question, why do we need to know his name? Why do we need that little detail? Because the Bible does not waste words. Never. There can be some things that can seem monotonous to us, but they're there for a reason. We can see, like genealogies in particular, being monotonous, or things concerning sacrifices under the Levitical priesthood as being monotonous details. while you may see them as monotonous, priests lived and died by those words. You don't, but priests did. Now, the Bible does not waste any words. And so why do we need to know about this young man named Saul? Because in 3 more verses, we're going to pick up with him just a little bit. And they stoned Stephen as he was calling on God and saying, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. Then he knelt down and cried out with a loud voice, Lord, do not charge them with this sin. And when he had said this, he fell asleep. When he said this, he died. All right, here is truly a good man. A good man just died. An innocent man just died. A man who was allowed to see Christ standing at the right hand of God just died by men who think they're doing right. And Saul is one of them. Saul does this with a completely clear conscience, evidently. Completely clear. Because we come into chapter 8, verse 1. Now Saul was consenting to his death. At that time a great persecution arose against the church, which was at Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the region of Judea and Samaria, except for the apostles. Then it continues on. And devout men carried Stephen to his burial and made great lamentation over him. As for Saul, he made havoc of the church, entering every house and dragging off men and women, committing them to prison. So here is Saul. Saul is at the stoning of Stephen. He is taking care of the clothes, the cloaks of the witnesses in all this. And he did not cast a stone. Okay, he did not cast a stone. Not that I'm aware of. By his own hands? No, not that I'm aware of. But complicit, absolutely complicit. Okay, it would be the same as taking someone to the murderer. that while the murderer is the one that wielded the weapon, who's the one that brought him to the murderer? Okay, it was Saul. Saul is all part of that machinery. He is part of that. And he doesn't have a problem with that. And while we find out in chapter 7:58, this first time we ever see his name, then 8 verses 1 and 2, we see more about him. That he's not just someone that stands around and keeps the cloaks of the witnesses. He is actively involved. It's bad enough that he did that, okay, of what he does. They laid down the clothes at the feet of a young man named Saul. Okay, it's bad enough that he did that, but he is actively involved in this. He's not a passive person. Being passive, that's also bad. But he's not passive. He is zealous. And God is going to use that zeal, correct his knowledge, and turn him with the truth. And that zeal is now going to be focused in the right direction, which is precisely what's going to happen. And when Jesus speaks of goads, a goad puts a cow or an ox in the right direction. You're not going to stand still. You're not going to go another direction. You're going to go the right direction. That's what a goad does. And Christ is going to present a powerful goad to Paul. Paul can be stubborn if he wanted to be. Paul could be, I'm talking about this in potentiality, not that he was, but in potentiality, he could do whatever he wanted to do. But he is going to follow God because he has that zeal. As I've said before, I'd rather have a Bible discussion or even have someone screaming at me who despises the Bible. I'd rather have a Bible discussion with someone who despises God, despises the Bible, than to have a one-sided discussion with someone who does not care about anything. That is just, just waiting patiently. And that it's meaningless to them. They are apathetic to the discussion. They're apathetic to all of it, and it's ground that they don't want to cover because they're uninterested. Someone who is hot against Christ at least has an interest somehow in all this. Somehow. They're wrong, but at least they have an interest. And with Saul of Tarsus, he is going to be turned, and it's the truth that he is given. First, by the fact of finding out who the Lord is, and then what Ananias is going to tell him he must do. And there's a purpose that is behind all this. One, obviously, it is mercy towards Saul of Tarsus, but also that of there's an apostle that is going to go out into the Gentile world now. And it is going to spread. The church is going to spread. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate everyone being here this morning. And hopefully we can continue this next week.